Coffin maker won a falling down in for 40 cents. 5 widows ran the kitchen. The deed was in my coat pocket when I rode into Harlan's Crossing the first time, and I'll tell you what, I almost didn't stop. The sign over the door had lost 2 of its letters, so it read Elm Oodin, and the porch was listing about 15 degrees toward the road like it had taken a long look at the world and decided to lean away from it. A shutter on the upper floor hung by one hinge and banged every time the wind came off the flats, which out there was constant. I pulled Remus up and sat a minute in the saddle. October. The cottonwoods along the creek bed had gone yellow and half their leaves were already on the ground. The sky was doing that thing it does out on the high plains in fall, where it gets so blue it almost hurts, and the light has no warmth in it at all, but everything looks sharp and close. I could smell snow somewhere above the horizon, not here yet but thinking about it. I'd won the place off a man named Dolan in a card game in Pueblo. He'd been drunk enough that he put up the deed. I'd been sober enough to take it, and the whole transaction had involved exactly 40 cents in the pot because neither of us was playing for money that night. We were just playing because neither of us had anywhere else to be. Dolan had laughed when I laid down my cards, laughed and shoved the deed across the table and said, "All yours, friend. The women'll eat you alive." Then he'd gotten up and walked out, and I never saw him again. The women, I didn't know what that meant at the time. Now I did, because they were all standing on that listing porch looking at me. 5 of them, all in black, which struck me as either coincidence or something else. They ranged from maybe 35 to what I'd put at 65, and they were standing in a line without having arranged themselves into one, the way people do when they're used to holding their ground together. The oldest had her arms crossed. The youngest had a broom in her hand, which she was not using on the porch but could have been using on a man if it came to it, and I felt she knew that. The one in the middle was the one I looked at twice. She was somewhere in her 40s, I'd say. Cheyenne blood plain in her face, which had a quality of stillness to it that was not blankness. Her hair was black and pinned back, and she had a way of standing that took up exactly the space she stood in and not an inch more, which I've always thought is the mark of someone who doesn't need to borrow room from the world to feel real. She was watching me the way you watch a man you don't know, and are not yet certain about but are willing to be patient with for the moment. I got down from Remus, tied him to what was left of the hitching post, put my hat in my hand, which I don't always do but seemed right. I said, "I believe I own this building." The oldest one said, "You do you?" It was not a question. My name is Caleb Morrow. I was 51 years old that October. I've been building Coffin since I was 19, which is a longer career than it sounds like when you say it fast. Started in Missouri, came west when Missouri got too crowded with people I knew, and had been working out of Pueblo for 11 years before that card game. I was not a man who made enemies, generally. I was not a man who made close friends either, which I sometimes thought about and mostly didn't. I was useful. I was quiet. I did work that nobody else wanted to do, and I did it well, which is its own kind of dignity when you strip it down to what it is. I knew wood. I knew how to read a plank for where it would give and where it would hold. I knew the difference between green lumber and seasoned, and what happens to a joint when the weather turns. I had tools that fit my hands the way tools only fit after 20 years of use. I did not have much else. I had a daughter back in Pueblo, grown. Her name was Ruth, and she lived there with her husband, who was a decent man, and I like to think she'd grown up watching me work and taken something from it, though she'd gone into teaching school rather than any trade. We wrote letters. I was not the kind of father you'd call warm, but I showed up when she needed me, which I think counts for something. She'd be the first to say it wasn't the same thing as warmth. She'd also be the first to say she knew I loved her. I think those two things can both be true. I'm not telling you this so you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you so you know the kind of man who walked up to that porch. The oldest one was named Gertrude Vance. She'd run the inn with her husband before he died of pneumonia 4 winters back. The husband, whose name had been Harold, had been, by general consensus, not much of a manager and somewhat of a drinker. But Gertrude had loved him in the particular stubborn way that some women love men who need more management than they admit to, and she mourned him seriously. After he died, she'd taken in 4 women who had nowhere else to go, and they'd all been running the place together ever since, which had been working badly because it hadn't been working at all. The roof over the east wing leaked. The boiler for the hot water had cracked the previous winter and never been fixed. The porch railing had given way in August, and a traveling salesman had fallen 3 feet into the flower bed, which had not pleased him. They hadn't had a paying guest in 6 weeks. The youngest was named Cora, and she was 36, and had come from Omaha after her husband was killed in an argument over a fence line. She did the baking, which was excellent. She was nervous in the way people are nervous when they've been made nervous by circumstances and are still working on getting back to their natural state, which I gathered had been cheerful. The one with the gray-streaked hair, and the quality of someone who had organized more things than she had words for, was named Beatrice. She kept the accounts, which were grim. She showed me the ledger the second day I was there, not to ask for anything, but because she was the kind of woman who believes the man in charge should be put in possession of the facts whether he wants them or not. I respected that. The facts were 3 months behind on the flour account, 2 months behind on the butcher, the roof repair that hadn't happened, the boiler, and a tax bill that was coming due in February that they had no answer for. The fourth was named Dorothea, who was 50 and had come from somewhere in Texas and did not discuss it, and whom I never asked. She was tall and spare, and did the laundry and the mending, and had opinions about everything, which she expressed in complete sentences with no preamble. She was usually right, which made her worth listening to even when she was abrasive. And then there was the one in the middle whose name I learned that first evening when Gertrude introduced them all. Her name was Nora Littlebird. She didn't say much at that introduction. She nodded. She had dark eyes that moved over you and seemed to take a measurement, and I had the sense she was somebody you could not put a false face on for long because she would see through it with no particular effort and no malice and simply file it away alongside the truth. She was the cook, not just the one who cooked the cook, the way some people are what they do, bone deep. She'd been there 2 years. She'd come from somewhere I didn't yet know, and she didn't volunteer it that night, and I didn't ask. What I noticed was this. When the other 4 were talking and moving around, their eyes went to her. Not all the time and not in any obvious way, just the way iron filings point north. She hadn't asked for that. It had happened because it was true. That first night I slept in what passed for the innkeeper's room, which smelled of mildew and had a window that didn't quite close. I lay there listening to the shutter bang upstairs, and I thought about what I'd got myself into. I was a coffin maker. I was not an innkeeper. I had no particular feeling either way about the inn as a business. What I had a feeling about, and I was honest with myself about this, lying there in the dark, was that I was not going to let a building fall down around 5 women because I'd won it in a card game and decided it was too much trouble. That was not who I was, or it was not who I wanted to be, which at 51 amounts to the same thing. I got up at first light. I went and looked at the porch in the gray morning. I came back in and ate breakfast, which was the best oatmeal I'd eaten in 10 years, rich with something cinnamon and cream and something underneath I couldn't name. I ate it alone in the dining room. Nora brought it without asking what I wanted and set it down and went back to the kitchen. I said, "Thank you." She said, which was not unfriendly, I thought. But it was a kind of wait and see. After breakfast, I got my tools from the pack on Remus and started on the porch. I didn't ask anyone. I just started. You can assess a structure by touching it, pressing it, looking at where the paint has gone and where the wood has gone gray and soft, and within an hour I knew most of what I needed to know. The sill plates were rotted in 2 places. The cross member supporting the left end of the porch roof had split along the grain, and the whole thing was being held up by friction and stubbornness. The boards on the floor were mostly sound, but 3 needed replacing. I had the main support replaced by noon. It was rough work because I'd had to shape a new timber from a piece I found in the shed out back, and the shed itself was worth noting for later because it had good bones but hadn't been used for much. I ate the noon meal in the kitchen because the dining room felt too large to sit in alone, and because the kitchen was where the warmth was. The 5 of them were in there, Nora at the stove, Cora rolling something, Gertrude at the table with what looked like correspondence, Beatrice going over her ledger at the far end, Dorothea mending by the window. I sat down at the corner of the kitchen table and ate what was put in front of me, which was a beef stew that made me understand something about what Dallin had meant when he'd said the women would eat me alive, except he'd meant it wrong. It was a very good stew. Nobody talked much. I didn't mind that. I said, "I'll have the porch finished by end of day tomorrow. After that, I want to look at the roof." Beatrice said, "There's no money for roofing materials." I said, "There's wood in that shed." Gertrude said, "That wood is not in good condition." I said, "Some of it is." Dorothea looked up from her mending and said, "He can tell which, look at his hands." Nobody said anything to that for a minute. Nora, who had her back to me at the stove, said nothing. but I saw her head tilt slightly, the way it does when you're listening to something even if you're not turning toward it. The porch took 2 days. The roof over the east wing took most of a week. The work on the boiler was beyond me without a part I didn't have. But I'd been in enough towns to know that a boiler man in a place like this usually had a circuit, and I sent a letter through the freight office to a man in Laramie whose name I knew from a job 2 years prior. And inside of 3 weeks he came through on his route and fixed it for what I thought was a fair price and Beatrice thought was highway robbery. He fixed it. The kitchen had hot water. The weather changed around the middle of November. The snow I'd smelled on the horizon in October arrived with its mind made up. A hard, early storm that dropped 1.5 feet on the flats and drifted against the north side of the building to the second-floor windows. I'd been worried about the north wall flashing. I'd fixed what I could see, but I hadn't been sure, and the storm told me I'd gotten most of it right. The east wing stayed dry. That felt like something. A man named Farwell came by the day after the storm, big man who ran the mercantile and clearly operated as a kind of civic authority in Harlan's Crossing. And he stood in the doorway of the inn and looked around with the expression of someone reassessing a situation they'd made certain assumptions about. He said, "I heard you were fixing the place up." I said, "That's right." He said, "What are your intentions with the property?" I said, "To keep it standing." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "Dollin let it go to hell." I said, "I know." He said, "You got the widow Vance and her companions still on here." I said, "They run the kitchen. That's the arrangement." He had an opinion about that, I could see it. He was the type who has opinions about arrangements involving women, especially arrangements that don't conform to a shape he already understands. But he also had eyes, and the porch was sound, and the east wing was dry, and the boiler was working, and he was looking at a building that was in better condition than it had been in 4 years. He said, "Well," and left. That evening, Nora brought coffee to the small room off the main hall where I'd set up a kind of workbench for smaller jobs, and she set it down on the edge of the bench without a word and turned to go. I said, "Sit a minute if you like." She stayed in the doorway, not rude, just not inside the room either. She looked at what I was working on, which was a replacement bracket for the staircase newel post. She said, "You're good at this." I said, "It's what I know." She said, "Dollin didn't know anything about it." I said, "So I hear." She said, "Harold Vance didn't either. He was a nice enough man, but he had no practical sense." She said it without judgment, just reporting. I said, "How long have you been here?" She said, 2 years in January. I said, "Before that?" She was quiet for a moment, not closed off exactly, more like she was deciding what the question was really asking and whether the answer was one she wanted to give tonight. Finally, she said, "Fort Lyon Way for a while, before that moving." I nodded, I didn't push. She said, "Cora thinks you're going to sell the place in the spring." I said, "I'm not going to sell the place in the spring." She looked at me, just looked, the way she did, level and patient. I said, "I don't have anywhere else I need to be." She picked up her coffee from where she'd set it down on the bench, and I realized she'd brought 2 cups. She set one in front of me. Then she leaned against the doorframe and drank hers, and I worked on the bracket, and we stayed like that for a while in the lamplight without talking, which was as comfortable a silence as I'd been in for a long time. December came. The days got short and the cold got serious, and there were 3 snowstorms in 2 weeks. We had 4 guests in that stretch, a drummer traveling north, a young couple going to meet her family for Christmas who got delayed by the second storm and stayed 5 nights instead of 2, and a schoolteacher from Cheyenne who needed somewhere to rest between stages. 4 is not many. 4 paid guests in a month would not keep the lights on, and Beatrice was not shy about the arithmetic. But something was happening that didn't show in the ledger. Word had gotten around. The porch was fixed. The place had heat and hot water. And the food was what Nora made, and what Nora made was unlike anything else you'd find between Pueblo and Laramie. I don't know how to describe it except to say it was the kind of cooking that reminds you there's more to being alive than whatever it is you've been settling for. The young couple, their name was Hannigan, sat in the dining room on their 3rd night, and the husband said to me, unprompted, "I don't know what that woman's doing in the kitchen, but it ought to be illegal." He meant it as a compliment, and it was. His wife said, "I asked for the recipe for the biscuits, and she told me the recipe, but I wrote it down wrong because she said it like it was obvious, and I missed something, and I'll never have biscuits like that again, and I'm slightly heartbroken about it." She was laughing when she said it. Nora was in the kitchen and did not hear this, but I told her later, and she made a sound that was close to a laugh, which was the closest I'd seen her get to one. I started telling people, not in a Barker kind of way. Just when men came by the freight office or I went into town for supplies, I mentioned the inn was open and the kitchen was worth the stop. I mentioned it to the man who ran the stage line. I mentioned it to a woman who kept a boarding house in the next town over, not as competition, but as something to send travelers toward who needed more than a bed. I wasn't a salesman, but I was willing to put the word out about something that deserved a word put out about it. Beatrice said the second week of December, guests are up. I said, little bit. She said, more than a little bit compared to this time last year. She had the ledger open. She turned it so I could see the numbers, which she would never have done with Dahlin, I gathered, because Dahlin would not have understood them and would have made it worse. I could read a ledger. I could see what the numbers meant and what they needed to become by February to handle that tax bill, and it was still a long way, but it was shorter than it had been in October. I said, let's put a sign up on the road. Beatrice said, we tried that. I said, a better sign, a visible one with the right letters on it. Gertrude, who had been pretending to read her correspondence from the other end of the table, said, Elwood Inn. I said I was thinking of changing the name. 4 of them looked at me. Nora came in from the kitchen with a pot of something and didn't say anything. I said something people remember. Dorothea said, what name? I said I'd think on it. I hadn't thought on it yet, but Remus had been looking at me from the stable like he had an opinion. That night I was in the workroom and Nora came to the door again. This was becoming a pattern neither of us had announced. She said, what names are you thinking of? I named a few. They were not good. She listened to each one and said nothing, which was as clear as if she'd said something. She said, what do you want people to think of when they think of this place? I said, a fire going, a meal, a solid roof. She said, those are things. I said, what would you call it? She was quiet a moment. Then she said, my grandmother called a place a home when she said people were well kept there. Well kept didn't mean fancy, it meant taken care of. I said, the well-kept house. She thought about it, too formal. I said, just well-kept. She looked at me. The lamp was behind her in the hall and her face was half in shadow. She said, that's a name. I built the sign on Christmas Eve, which I spent in the workroom because that is the kind of man I am and had always been. Ruth sent a letter that arrived 2 days before, which I read twice and put in the inside pocket of my coat, which is where I keep the things I want to keep. She said she was well and the school was keeping her busy, and she hoped I had found somewhere comfortable to spend the winter and not just a shed somewhere. I smiled at that because she knew me, and because a shed somewhere was precisely where I'd spent more than one Christmas in my life and not minded it. This was better than a shed. Around 9 that night, Nora knocked on the workroom door and came in with a plate. She'd made a kind of spiced cake that smelled of cardamom and orange peel, which I had not expected, and which was extraordinary. She set it on the corner of the bench and looked at the sign, which was about half painted. She said, well kept. I said, that's the idea. She reached out and touched the edge of the plank, testing the paint. It was dry enough. She ran her finger along the W. She said, my mother would have liked this. I didn't say anything. She said she was a very particular person, about quality, about whether a thing was done right. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the sign. She'd have said this was done right. I said, high praise. She said, it is. Then she looked at me, that steady, patient look. I mean it. I said, I know. The sign went up New Year's morning, which was cold enough to freeze the hair in your nose, and 3 of the widows came out in their coats to watch it go up even though they didn't need to, and Cora made something celebratory for breakfast that involved a great deal of butter. Nora stayed in the kitchen, which was where she was most mornings, but when I came in to warm my hands at the stove after getting the sign mounted, she looked at me and said, it's straight. I said, plumb level. She said, good, and handed me a cup of coffee. Gertrude said something that evening about Dahlin. She said, you know, he came through here once before he lost the place. Harold was still alive. He sat in that dining room and ate Nora's food and said he'd never eaten anything so good in his life. I said, and then he let the place fall apart. Gertrude said he didn't understand what he had. That sat in the air for a moment. She said some men don't, not until it's gone. I didn't answer that. I thought about it later. February, the tax bill came and we paid it. Not easily, but we paid it, and Beatrice looked at the ledger for a long time after and then said, "We'll do better in spring." We did better in spring. The stage line added the well-kept as a regular stop in April. A freighting outfit started sending their men there when they were coming through, 4 or 5 at a time, which meant a lot of food and a lot of coffee and kept Cora baking from dawn to supper. A family from Kansas came through in May on their way to Oregon and stayed a week, and the husband spent 3 days helping me work on the stable while his wife and daughters helped Nora in the kitchen. And on the evening before they left, the husband said to me over a smoke on the repaired porch, "You've got something here." I said bit by bit. He said more than that. I didn't argue. What was becoming clear as the months passed was that I was useful here in a way I had not expected to be useful anywhere since Ruth had grown up and no longer needed me to hold things together. There was always something. The well housing needed new boards. The stable roof needed work. A section of fence along the road wanted replacing. A man named Tibbs came through in April wanting to buy a load of timber from the shed, which I sold him except for what I needed. And that money paid for a new cast-iron range that Nora had mentioned once, in a way that was not a request, but was not a request either. When the range arrived and got set in, she ran her hands along the top of it the way you touch a tool that was made right, and said nothing, and cooked a meal on it that night that made Cora actually weep a little, which everyone pretended not to notice. Dorothea said to me later, quiet, "She hasn't had things be right for a long time." I said, "How long?" Dorothea said, "Long." I didn't push. I was starting to understand that there were things Nora carried that were hers, and that she would offer them when she was ready and not before, and that the offer would be on her terms or not at all. That was fine with me. I was not a man in a hurry. It was May, the mild end of it, when I found her one morning before breakfast in the kitchen garden that she'd started behind the building. She was kneeling in the dirt in the half-light, her hands working around a row of seedlings, and she didn't hear me come up because I walk quiet, which is a habit from years of work that requires concentration. I stopped before I'd disturbed anything. I watched her work. She had her sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her hands were quick and certain in the soil in a way that was the same as her hands in the kitchen, no wasted motion, everything going where it was supposed to. A thrush was going somewhere in the cottonwoods. The sky was that pale, early morning color that doesn't last long. She looked up and saw me. She didn't startle. She said, "You're up early." I said, "Always." She sat back on her heels and looked at what she'd been doing. She said, "Beans. And there's a row of squash at the end that I'm not sure about. The soil here is better than I thought it would be." I said, "I put some compost in along the back wall, from the stable." She looked at me, "When?" I said, "March, couple times." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden. Then she said, "You did that without saying anything." I said, "Didn't seem necessary to say anything." She put her hands on her knees and looked at me with an expression I had not seen from her before. Not the patient measuring look, something more open than that. She said, "You've been quietly fixing things since you got here." I said, "That's what I do." She said, "I know." She paused. "I've been watching." A long moment, the thrush again, the pale sky going warmer. She said, "I want to tell you something." I waited. She said, "When you came here, I thought you were another Dolan, another man who'd look at what we had and not see it and let it fall apart while he wasn't paying attention and eventually move on." She looked at her hands, then back at me. I was ready for that. I said, "And?" She said, "And you're not that." She said it plain, the way she said most things. No softening, no ceremony, just the truth laid out. And it hit me the way plain truth does when you've been working for a long time in a place where nobody's told you you're doing all right. I said, "I'm just building what needs building." She said, "I know what you're doing. I've known for months." She got to her feet, brushing the dirt from her skirt. She was about at my shoulder height. She looked up at me and said, "What I'm telling you is that I see it, and I'm not going anywhere." She reached out and put her hand on my arm. Not a formal thing, not a reaching for something thing, just her hand on my arm for a moment, solid and certain the way she was. I could feel the warmth of it through my sleeve. Then she said, "Coffee's nearly ready," and went back inside. I stood there in the garden for a little while longer. The sky was full light now. The squash row at the end was questionable. She was right about that, but the beans looked strong. Summer settled in and the well-kept filled up. Not every night, not the kind of traffic that a hotel in a real town gets, but regular, steady. A freighting crew every couple of weeks, travelers off the southern routes. A mining man who came through every month and always took the same room and always ate the same breakfast, and on his third visit knew enough to arrive on Thursday, which was the night Nora made the braised short ribs, and he said once, to no one in particular, "I've been to Denver and I've been to Santa Fe, and I'll be honest with you, I've not eaten like this anywhere." He looked around the dining room like he was trying to understand it. "Don't know how you've kept this place quiet." I said, "We're not quiet, we're just not on the main road." He said, "You should be." I said, "Maybe." But I didn't want the main road, not exactly. There was something about Harlan's Crossing, about the particular flat-bottomed quietness of it, that suited me. The light in the morning, the way the planes ran south with nothing interrupting them. The cold came early and the spring came late, and everything between was a kind of wrestling with the country that I understood without thinking about it. Remus had put on weight. He looked better than he had in 2 years, and he knew it. I built a new table for the dining room in July, a big one, because Nora had said once that a table ought to be able to seat 12 without anyone being crowded, and the table that was there seated 8 with elbowing. I built it from a big piece of elm I found at the back of Tibbs's yard, which Tibbs had been meaning to do something with for 4 years and hadn't. Nora came and looked at it when I got it set in place, and she walked around it once and ran her hand along the top and said, "Good grain." I said, "Straight-grained, yeah." She said, "It'll last 100 years." I said, "At least." She pulled out a chair and sat down at it, which was the first time I'd seen her sit in the dining room. She looked at the room from that vantage, the way a person looks at a place they've been working in from a new angle. She said, "It looks like a real place." I sat down across from her. I said, "It is a real place." She put her hands flat on the table. My table, the elm I'd found and shaped and smoothed. She said, "When I came here I didn't think I was staying. I thought I'd stay a season and move on. That's what I'd been doing." I said, "You were moving since Fort Lyon." She looked at me. She hadn't told me much about Fort Lyon. She said, "Before Fort Lyon, too." A pause. "I grew up moving. It was not a thing anyone chose for us." I didn't say anything. She said, "I stopped moving here. I don't know exactly when, but at some point I stopped thinking about where next." She looked at her hands on the table. "I think you had something to do with that." I said, "Probably just the food." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, as close as she usually got, which I had come to know was not a small thing. She said, "The food was already here." I said, "I know." She said, "So." I said, "So." We stayed at that table for a while, in the evening light coming through the dining room windows, and neither of us said anything else for a time, and it was all right. There is a thing that happens with a building, a real one, when you've put your hands on every piece of it. You know it the way you know your own body. You know which step has a squeak that'll never go away because the joist underneath is sound but not perfect. And you know which window sticks in the rain. And you know that the back door hangs true in all weather because you rehung it on 3 new hinges and got the jamb perfectly plumb the second try. You know the place the way you know a piece of wood you've worked, where it'll hold and where it might give, and what it needs to be what it can be. By fall I knew the well-kept that way. I also knew the woman in the kitchen, not entirely. I don't think you ever know anyone entirely, and I'd be suspicious of a man who claimed he did. But I knew the weight of what she carried, some of it not because she'd told me all of it, but because I'd watched her for a year and paid attention. I knew she got up before anyone else. I knew the garden was not just a garden to her, but a kind of proof that something planted could stay planted, that ground could be tended and yield something. I knew she had a younger sister she wrote to somewhere west, and that the letters back came slowly and sometimes not at all, and that on those days she was quieter than usual in a way only Gertrude, and I seemed to notice. I knew she drank her coffee black and that she had an opinion about cardamom, which was that no one used enough of it, and that she was right. I knew that when she said something was good she meant it exactly, and when she said nothing it could mean several things depending on the set of her shoulders. I knew her voice. In October, the first anniversary of when I'd ridden into Harlan's Crossing and seen that listing porch and those 5 women, Cora baked a cake, because Cora baked a cake for everything. We ate it in the kitchen after supper, the 6 of us, which was not a thing that happened regularly because there was usually something to be done. But Cora had made the case, and the cake was too good to argue with. Gertrude said 1 year. I said 1 year. Dorothea said, the roof has not leaked. I said no. Beatrice said, the February tax bill is already accounted for. I want that on the record. I said noted. Cora said, I'm so happy here. Nobody knew what to do with that because it was so simply and completely true that it didn't need a response. So nobody gave it one, and Cora didn't seem to need it. Nora said same. Just the one word. She was looking at her cake. Then she looked up and across the table and found my eye for a moment, and what was in her face in that moment was something I can only call the end of watchfulness. The particular relaxing of a caution that has been in place for a long time and is no longer needed. I said same. There's not a neat way to finish a story that doesn't have a neat ending, and this doesn't have a neat ending because it didn't end. It just kept going. The well-kept is still standing. The elm table is still in the dining room, and it hasn't warped in 9 winters, which I take some quiet pride in. Gertrude passed 2 years ago, and Dorothea is back in Texas, and Beatrice took a job at a land office in Denver because they needed someone who understood numbers. Cora is still here, still baking. There's a girl who helps her now, a young woman from the Cheyenne agency north of here who is 18 and who learned to bake from Cora, and who is now better at some things than Cora, which Cora will tell you herself without any grudging about it. Nora runs the kitchen. Still, she's added 2 things to the menu that she wouldn't have attempted 10 years ago because she didn't have the range or the flour to do them right, and now she has both, and they are extraordinary. Her sister came last spring from Oregon and stayed 3 weeks, and on the last morning I found the 2 of them sitting in the kitchen garden before breakfast, talking low, and I went back inside without disturbing anything. We are not a man and a woman who speak about what we are. We've never found it necessary. She knows what I am to this place and to her. I know what she is to this place and to me. On the evenings when there's no particular urgency, she comes to the workroom sometimes, and I'm doing something small with my hands and she has coffee, and we talk about the garden or the guests or something Cora said that was funny, or we don't talk at all. Last winter she brought a piece of needlework she'd been working on and sat across the bench from me, and we worked in the lamp's circle for 2 hours without saying much, and I thought, well, I thought this is what it is. A man with his hands doing what his hands know how to do, and a woman across the table who is not going anywhere, and the building around us solid, and outside the plains dark and wide, and the cold doing what cold does, and inside the fire and the smell of whatever she's been making, and the close, warm quiet of a place that has been looked after. That's what 40 cents won me, not the building. The building I built. I mean what was in it. I mean what it became. I mean her.